These three true disturbing park ranger horror stories are inspired by real events. First, a ranger is stalked by something that leaves a human print, with an impossible, terrifying 4-foot stride. Then, a lost hiker is saved by a silent rescuer, in a uniform that hasn't been worn in decades. And finally, a ranger hikes 12 miles into a raging storm to answer a desperate cry for help. Make sure you watch until the very end, because when he gets there, the only thing he finds is a dead, corroded radio. And you'll learn the truly shocking identity of the voice that was on it. For 3 miles through Yellowstone's most remote backcountry, something was matching his every step. The incident happened in 2019, deep in the Thorofare region of Yellowstone National Park. This is not the Yellowstone of postcards. This is the most remote, isolated wilderness in the lower 48 states. Park veterans have a saying for it. It's not a park, it's a cage where the bars are 50 miles of nothing. That summer, the cage belonged to a patrol veteran named Sawyer. Sawyer was a man of 20 years on the job, a creature of absolute routine. He believed in the evidence on the ground, the weight of the rifle on his shoulder, and the familiar solid sound of his own boots packing the dirt. This patrol was a routine 5-day solo trip. It was day 2. The air was clean, sharp, and carried only the scent of pine and damp earth. The only sounds for dozens of miles were the natural ones: the distant cry of a hawk, the rush of a far-off river, and the steady thud-crunch of Sawyer's own measured pace. He was, as he should be, utterly alone. It was late morning when he stopped. He was moving back along a game trail he had walked the previous day, retracing his steps toward a planned river crossing. He hadn't heard a sound. No twig snap, no cough, no rustle of fabric. It was a feeling, a sudden prickling wrongness that made him freeze mid-stride. He looked down. There in the packed dirt was his own boot print from the day before, and laid perfectly, impossibly on top of it was another print, a fresh one. Sawyer kneeled. His mind, trained by decades of tracking, went cold and clinical. It was a standard hiking boot, a generic solid tread, but it was fresh. The edges of the print were sharp, the dirt still holding the dampness of its impression. It had been made minutes ago. This meant the person who made it was, or had just been, right behind him. But that was impossible. He was the only person signed into the entire sector. His first thought was a poacher, but they were ghosts. They wouldn't be this bold, this sloppy. His next thought was a lost hiker. He unclipped the radio handset from his shoulder strap. The click of the button was loud in the silence. "Dispatch, this is Sawyer. Just running a check on the registry for my sector. Any new check-ins?" The voice of Joss, the dispatcher, crackled back, thin and distant. "Negative, Sawyer. You're the only soul in the Thorofare. Registry's been empty for 2 weeks." Sawyer clipped the radio back onto its strap. His blood ran cold. He stood up slowly. The print was impossible. It was made after he had passed this way, by a person who did not exist. He looked into the dense forest, the wall of trees silent and watchful. He took a breath and kept walking, his eyes now scanning the ground ahead. There it was again, his print. The other print laid perfectly atop it, and again, and again. It was as if this person was not just following him, but meticulously, deliberately consuming his steps. His absolute certainty of being alone, the very foundation of his psychological safety, was gone. He stopped again. That was when the second, truly unnatural detail revealed itself. The gait was wrong. He pulled the small tape measure from his belt pouch. He kneeled and measured the distance. From the heel of one print to the toe of the next, the stride length was exactly, mathematically, 4 feet. 4 feet. He stood and tried to replicate it himself. He was a tall man, but forcing his legs to that length was a clumsy, lurching, painful scramble. This was not a run. A running print would be splayed, deep at the toe from the push-off. This was a walk, a calm, measured, perfectly elongated stride that violated the physics of a human body. It was a human sign that was not human. He began to walk faster. The 3-mile trek through that dense forest began. For the first mile, it was a test of nerve. He kept his pace fast, professional. He could hear his own heart, a low thump, thump, thump in his ears. He kept looking back over his shoulder. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. No footsteps, no snapping branches, just the silent, indifferent trees. And every time he looked down, the prints were there. His, then the fresh 4-foot stride. For the second mile, the dread began to set in. The entity was toying with him. It was staying just out of sight, matching his faster pace with its own impossible silent glide. He felt a sudden, desperate need to hear a human voice. He grabbed his radio again. He pressed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Sawyer. He was cut off by a burst of white noise. A loud, grating, electric shriek filled his ear. He pulled the handset away, wincing. But it wasn't just static. It had a rhythm, a slow, heavy shush, shush, shush. Like a heavy breath being taken over and over, measured precisely to the beat of his own frantic steps. He threw the radio back against his chest. It was not just following, it was listening. It was on his frequency. It was mocking him. The third mile was a quiet, controlled panic. The forest was dense here, the path narrow. The walls were closing in. The terror was no longer in the prints. It was in the intent. It was in the silence. The entity was so close, just behind the next bend, that it could lay its print down in the dirt he had just kicked up. But it made no sound. His own passage was loud. The zip of his jacket, the crunch of his boots, the rustle of his pack. The thing behind him was utterly silent. He was losing his mind, his 20 years of competence dissolving into the raw, primal fear of being hunted. He saw it ahead. A low, rocky outcrop, a sheer ascent that offered elevation, a clear radio signal, a chance. He broke his stride and bolted. He scrambled, clawing his way up the rock face. The sound of his boots scraping on stone was sharp and desperate. His pack straps dug into his shoulders. His breathing was a raw, ragged gasp that echoed in the quiet air. At the top, his muscles burning, he tore the handset from his pack and slammed it open. He didn't whisper. He took one raw, forced breath and screamed into the speaker. "Dispatch, this is Sawyer. I need extraction. Thorofare Grid 7. I am being followed by human sign that is not human." He held the radio in a death grip, his chest heaving. He waited for Joss's voice. He waited for the static breath. He waited for any sound from the trees below. There was nothing, just silence. He looked down. At the base of the rock, where his own prints were scuffed and chaotic from his scramble, was the final print. A single, meticulous print of a standard hiking boot, measured 4 feet exactly from the one before it. The dirt was still settling, and then nothing. The tracks stopped. They stopped at the exact point where he radioed for help. No prints led away, no scuff marks, no signs of a turn. The entity had simply and completely vanished. Joss logged the frantic call. The sheer, naked panic in a 20-year veteran's voice sent up every alarm. A backup team was mobilized. They arrived hours later to find a shaken, exhausted Sawyer at the top of the rock. They confirmed the scene. They saw his prints. And they saw the single, unbroken line of impossible 4-foot strides leading for 3 miles, right to the base of that rock. The investigation was quiet. The case remains an open, unexplained event in the National Park Service files. Sawyer left the service. He was a man permanently changed, a man who knew a terrifying secret about the quiet, empty places of the world. The thing hadn't needed to catch him. It had simply needed to prove it could. The most terrifying thought is that the thing is still out there, its patience as endless as the wilderness itself. If a thing can perfectly imitate the sign of a human while utterly violating the physics of a human gait, what else can it imitate? And how many times have you been out on a familiar path, heard a sudden silence, and never bothered to look behind the bend to see what was waiting? The SAR team found the missing hiker alive, but something else found him first. This was back in 2021, in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. That place is 2,000 square miles of trees, rock, and fog. It's beautiful on a postcard, but on the ground, it's a problem. It's a green maze that doesn't care if you live or die. It swallows people. The job of the search and rescue team is to pull them back out before that happens. The call came in late afternoon, around 4:30 p.m. A hiker named Hart was overdue. He was in his 30s, a first-timer on this section of the Appalachian Trail, reported missing near an unmarked junction. Those little turnoffs are traps. They look like shortcuts, but they're just places to get lost. Hart's GPS had pinged an hour before the call, but that signal was a ghost now. It just told them where he was, not where he is. Anya ran the command post. She was the boss, the one who had to turn a single GPS point into a search area. The sun was already dropping. In those mountains, the shadows don't just get longer. They rise up from the ground and eat the light. She had to get her people moving. She deployed the SAR team. 6 rangers split into 3 teams of 2. They were carrying 70-pound packs loaded with medical gear, ropes, water, and emergency shelters. They started a grid search, fanning out from Hart's last known point. This wasn't a casual walk. This was hard work. They were moving shoulder to shoulder, pushing through soaking wet rhododendron bushes that were so thick they had to turn sideways to get through. Their headlamps cut weak, yellow circles in the heavy, wet air. While they were searching, Hart was learning just how bad his mistake was. He'd taken the turnoff, followed what he thought was a trail for 20 minutes, and then it just stopped. It dissolved into a wall of briars and fallen trees. He turned around, but the woods he'd just walked through looked completely different. Every tree was the same tree. He yelled, but the sound of his own voice was small. It didn't echo. It just died, soaked up by the moss and the leaves. That's when the panic started. He checked his phone. No signal. He yelled again, louder this time, until his throat felt raw. Nothing, just the sound of his own breathing. The sun was gone. It didn't set. It just vanished. And with it, the temperature dropped. Not slowly, but all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door. He was wearing a thin rain shell and a day pack. He was not ready for a night. Just after midnight, the rain started. It wasn't a storm, just a steady, miserable drizzle that turned the forest floor into a slick, silent mud bath. For the SAR teams, it was a nightmare. It washed away any possible tracks. It made the steep ground treacherous. They were calling out his name, a standard call and response, but the rain was a constant hissing noise that swallowed their voices. For Hart, the rain was a disaster. He found a small rock overhang and huddled under it, shaking. He wasn't just cold, he was wet. a deep, soaking wet that pulled the heat right out of his bones. He shook so hard his teeth clicked together. He tried to think, to make a plan, but his mind was just a loop of one thought. I made a mistake. I made a mistake. The clock kept moving. Back at the command post, Anya was drinking bitter coffee and running scenarios. 18 hours had passed since the last confirmed sighting. That was the window. After 18 hours in the cold and wet, you're not dealing with a lost hiker anymore. You're dealing with a hypothermia case, a broken leg, a fall. The woods break you down fast. She was getting ready to call in the dogs for a body recovery. That's when the radio crackled. It was Ranger Ben, his voice clipped and strained. Command, this is Team Alpha. I've got contact. Quadrant D17. He's way off trail. He's alive. Anya felt the pressure in her chest ease, but only for a second. Ben's voice was wrong. He wasn't relieved. He was confused. He's alive, but I need medical support at my position. Now. Anya and the medic took the chopper as close as the terrain would let them, then hiked the last half mile. They found Ben standing over Hart. The hiker was sitting up, his back against a massive oak tree. He was shivering, and his skin was a pale grayish color. He was badly dehydrated, but he was alive. His eyes were open, and they were tracking. The medic got to work immediately, cutting away a sleeve, getting an IV line in. Hart winced, but he didn't say anything. He just stared. Anya knelt in the mud. She looked where Hart was looking. He wasn't looking at his rescuers. He was looking past them, into the dense, dark woods behind them. He was terrified, but it wasn't the terror of a man who was lost. It was the terror of a man who had seen something that didn't make sense. As the saline started to drip into his arm, Hart finally spoke. His voice was a dry, scratching whisper, like dead leaves. Someone else found me first. Anya kept her voice calm, professional. Hart, my name is Anya. You're safe now. We've got you. He shook his head, a weak, jerky motion. No. Before you. Someone else. A ranger. He found me. Ben and Anya looked at each other. Ben was the only ranger in this quadrant. Hart, Ben said gently. I'm the only ranger on this team. It was me you heard. Not you, Hart insisted. His eyes were wide. He was old. His uniform. It was old. He described the figure. A man standing completely still by a tree. He wasn't a hiker. He was wearing a ranger uniform, but it wasn't their modern synthetic gear. It was heavy, wool-like fabric, a thick olive green color. The kind of uniform Hart had only seen in black and white photos, a 1970s style. The figure didn't say a word. He was silent. Hart, who was at the absolute end of his rope, had been stumbling, falling, ready to just lie down and let it be over. Then this ranger was just there. He didn't walk out of the woods, he was just there. The silent ranger just looked at him, then raised an arm and pointed. Hart, with nothing left, followed. The ranger moved through the undergrowth without making a sound, leading him 50 yards to a small crack in the rocks, half hidden by ferns. A tiny, crystal-clear spring spilled out into a small pool. Hart said he just fell on it. He buried his face in the water and drank. He said it was the best water he'd ever tasted in his life. The whole time, the ranger just stood there, watching him, silent. Hart finally got his breath, felt the first bit of life come back. He turned to thank the man, to ask him where they were. That's when he heard it. A new sound, the crackle of a radio, the sound of Ben and the other ranger yelling his name. Modern, real-world noise. Hart looked back at the silent ranger. The man hadn't moved. He wasn't scared, he wasn't startled. He just stood there. Hart blinked, and when he opened his eyes, the ranger was gone. Not walked away, not ran off, just gone, erased from the landscape. Hart was left alone, sitting next to a secret spring, hearing the sound of boots crunching on the leaves. Back at headquarters, after Hart was airlifted out, Anya couldn't let it go. People see things when they're in shock, but Hart's details were too specific. She sent Ranger Ben back out. "Ben, find that spring. I want to know if it's real." An hour later, Ben's voice came over the radio and he sounded spooked. "Anya, the spring is here. It's exactly where he said. But it's not on any map I've ever seen. Not the new GPS ones, not the old paper ones." That was the first piece. The uniform was the second. Anya went to the park's historian, an old-timer who had been there forever. She described the heavy olive-green wool uniform. The historian nodded. "Oh yeah, standard issue, pre-1980. We decommissioned those in '79. Heavy, terrible in the rain." "Why?" Anya didn't answer. She went to the archives, dusty binders and shelves of old yellowing files. She pulled the personnel and incident reports for Quadrant D17. She went back, year by year. 1980, 1979, 1978. And there it was, a single typewritten page. Ranger Vernon Ledford, died on duty, 1978. A sudden massive rock slide on a remote trail. The quadrant of the accident, D17, the same area. Anya cross-referenced the spring's location with the historian. He confirmed it. The spring wasn't on public maps, but the veteran rangers all knew about it. It was an old-timer's emergency water source. It was Ledford's old patrol route. Anya closed the file. She saw Hart's discharge papers a few days later. She asked him one last time. He confirmed it. He had no knowledge of a 1978 death. He didn't know a thing about ranger uniforms. He was just a lost man who was saved by a ghost. The SAR team did their job, but Vernon Ledford did his first. He died on that mountain, and he's still on duty. He's still protecting visitors, using knowledge that only the dead could remember. It makes you wonder, when you're out in the deep woods and you think you're completely, finally alone, you're probably wrong. The distress call came from 12 miles into the rainforest. The ranger who responded wishes he never answered. It was 2020, late in the season, at Olympic National Park in Washington. A heavy, wet darkness had settled over the Hoh Ranger Station. Rain hadn't started yet, but you could smell it. It felt like a thick, wet carpet had been thrown over the whole valley. A veteran ranger, a man who'd spent 20 years logging and another decade on trail crews, was alone in the station. He knew these woods. He was prepping the remote outpost for a massive storm, the kind that washes out roads and rips old-growth trees right out by the roots. The only light in the station was the weak yellow glow from his desk lamp, shining on maps and reports. The generator was running, but he liked to keep the power low, save the fuel. He stood up, his boots making a heavy sound on the old wood floor. He was pouring a cup of coffee, thin and bitter from a pot that had been on for hours, when the radio signal finally cut through the air. It wasn't the usual comforting hiss of a working radio. This was a frantic, strained voice, fighting its way through a solid wall of electronic grit and static. The sound was ugly. The call was on a high-priority distress band, the one nobody ever wants to hear. It was the sound of a pure, immediate emergency. "This is Linnea. I need immediate extraction. 12 miles deep, near the old logging clearing. I'm hurt bad. Please, you have to hurry." The voice was young, rough with panic, and it sounded desperately real. The ranger put his coffee down. He moved to the wall map. He checked the coordinates she gave. 12 miles. 12 miles of hellish steep ground, deep in the Hoh rainforest. Switchbacks, known washouts, and dozens of deadfalls. He checked the time, 8:15 p.m. That was a 4-hour hike, one way, in the best conditions, and a storm was closing in. It was also a serious rule break to go alone. Protocol demanded 2 rangers for any extraction, period. But the sheer panic in her voice wasn't a request. It was a physical demand. He'd known men who'd waited for backup and found a body instead. He looked out the window. The wind was already howling through the high canopy. The weather was closing in fast. If he waited for a partner, the storm would make it impossible for anyone to get there until morning. He made the call. "Corbin on the move. ETA is unknown. Hold tight, Linnea. I'm coming," he said into his handset. He didn't shout. He was a professional. He just spoke loud and clear. The radio just spit a noisy static back at him. No confirmation. He didn't wait. He slammed his pack shut, checked the load. First aid kit, extra batteries, water, survival gear. He grabbed his service rifle, more for animals than anything else, and plunged into the wet, heavy darkness of the forest. The sound of the heavy station door slamming shut behind him was final. The hike was brutal. For 4 hours, he was just a machine. The sound of his boots sucking in the mud was constant. The steady drip of water from the canopy was everywhere. He was off the main trail now, on an old, unmaintained spur that led to the clearing. The forest here was ancient. The trees were giants. Everything, the trunks, the branches, the ground, was covered in a thick carpet of moss. It made the whole world quiet. Too quiet. The sound of his own breathing, ragged in his chest, was all he could hear. He hit the coordinates just after midnight. His GPS unit beeped, confirming it. This was the spot. He looked up from the screen. It was a small clearing, but it wasn't a campsite. Not anymore. It was choked with shoulder-high ferns and new-growth alder. Old, mossy logs were scattered everywhere. It was clear nobody had camped here for years. He shouted, "This is Park Service. Is anyone here?" His voice just died. The moss and the trees soaked up the sound like a sponge. There was no echo. He unslung his pack, pulling out his high-powered flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but wet leaves. His boot kicked something hard, hidden under a thick mat of moss and pine needles. He crouched down, pulling his glove off. He dug his fingers into the wet earth and pulled it out. It was a radio. A heavy, old-style emergency radio unit. He turned it over in his hands. The plastic was cracked. The battery cover was gone. He looked inside the tray. The batteries were still there, but they were white and swollen with corrosion. They had leaked a crusty, acidic powder all over the terminals. This thing was junk. It was completely, utterly dead. It hadn't had power in months, maybe years. He stood up, holding the useless piece of plastic. This didn't make sense. He'd heard her. He'd hiked 12 miles. He wasn't leaving. "Linnea!" he shouted again, louder this time. "This is Ranger Corbin. I'm at the clearing." Maybe she'd lost this radio and had a backup. Maybe she'd crawled away from this spot, injured. He wasn't going to hike 4 hours back until he had cleared the area. He was a professional. For the next hour, he did his job. He ran a full grid search of the clearing and the perimeter. He pushed through shoulder-high ferns, his flashlight beam cutting the dark. He checked behind every log, in every hollow. The sound of the wind was picking up, whistling through the canopy, but there was no answer. No tracks, no broken branches, no scrap of a tent, no backpack, no sign of a human being at all. After an hour of this, he stood in the center of the clearing, his breath fogging in the headlamp beam. There was nothing. He was alone. The call was real, but the person wasn't here. He'd broken protocol for nothing. He gathered himself. He was exhausted, confused, and now, finally, he felt a deep unease. He was 12 miles deep, and he had a 4-hour hike back in a rising storm. He shoved the dead radio into his evidence bag and packed it away. He turned and started moving. He just focused on the sound of his own feet, hitting the trail, one after another, getting him out of those trees. He got back to the station, slammed the door, and threw the bolt. He sat there in his wet gear, the dead radio on the desk in front of him, until the sun came up. He got on the main radio and called in his report to his supervisor. He told him everything. The call, the name Linnea, the empty clearing, the 4-hour hike, the dead, corroded radio. There was a long silence on the other end of the radio, just a light hiss. Finally, his supervisor's voice came back, tight. He told the ranger to sit tight and wait for a relief team. An hour later, the supervisor called back. He had checked the missing persons database for that sector, cross-referencing the name he'd heard. Linnea was on the list, a missing hiker from 2018, 2 years ago. Her last known location was near the very trail he had just been on. She was never found. The ranger's first thought, the only one that made any sense, was that he was losing it. That the 24 hours on duty, the stress of the storm, the exhaustion, that he'd imagined the voice. He thought he'd hiked 12 miles in the dark, chasing a hiss of static that his tired brain turned into words. But that theory fell apart. How did he imagine the exact name of a real missing person from 2 years prior? The official report was a compromise. The coordinates were flagged based on the ranger's discovery of the radio and its connection to the 2018 cold case. Internally, the site is now marked with a do not approach code. But that wasn't the end for the ranger. For the next 3 days, while he was back at the station writing reports, it kept happening. The radio on the desk would crackle. The other rangers in the room wouldn't even look up. They just heard static. A burst of noise, but he heard it clear as a bell. "I'm hurt bad. Please, you have to hurry." He'd look up, his heart pounding. The other rangers would be drinking coffee, talking about the weather. They heard nothing. He was the only one. It happened 4 more times. A frantic, desperate voice crying for help out of a speaker that, to everyone else, was just hissing. He stopped reacting. He just sat there, listening to a call that wasn't there. Was he the only one who could hear it? Or was he the only one it was calling for? After the 3rd day, it stopped. He never heard the voice again. He never filed a report on those last 3 days. Who would he tell? He logged the radio as evidence and quietly put in for a transfer to a different park.